Okay, it's been a while since we've talked. I think we had our live lecture last Tuesday, but then we had time for taking midterm too. So let's kind of get back into sort of our final push here of some new material and get ready to do the last project. So as a little review, um, so an application basically is made up of some kind of widgets, little things like buttons and sliders and so on. And when you're running the program, you do actions of some sort, like click a mouse or type a key, and those create some kind of events. And the PyQt system creates a signal from those events. So if you click a mouse, that's just a mouse click. But if you click a mouse on a Qt button, it turns that into a button pressed signal. And then we connect that signal to a slot in another widget. And the slot is basically some kind of function that does something in response to the signal. And your job when you're writing a GUI program is basically to define those connections between the different parts and define any slots. That was my cat doing something, I don't know what. Then define some slots, some functions to define behavior when things happen, as long as it's something custom that you want to have happen. So so we did a little example where we're connecting different widgets together with signals and slots, and they updated themselves, and that was all predefined kind of behavior. So let's try to do something with a little more custom behavior. So let's make a little picture flip book kind of thing. I want to have some images, and I can switch between them using a button or something like that. So show a picture, press a button, change the picture, and as a first step, when I see a problem like this, it's important to kind of have some rough idea how to problem solve it. And so again, I sort of know how to press a button and make something happen when I press a button. I don't know how to show a picture in PyQt. We've done it in other systems, that graphics package and so on. So, when you see something like this, it's perfectly fine to Google it, PyQt5, make sure you're in the right sort of version of PyQt, show image or something like that, and it might tell you some stuff. So in there, if I Google around, I've seen some example code maybe, and there's this QPixMap, and I can set it on a label. So let's go back over here. This is like a real basic application. I make an application, I start the application, and in between I basically show a label as the main window. So if I run this, I get a little tiny hi there, squished, into barely fitting in this thing. And it still has some behavior, it keeps centered up and down, for example, and I can kill it off. All right, so instead of a label, I'm going to have an empty label, and I'm going to make a pixmap, basically an image, and it is a QPixMap. And in this project, I've already added an image file, me.png, so it can find it. And then I'm going to set the pixmap of the label to this image I just loaded. All right. So again, how did I know that? It was just from sort of Googling around, and for this particular system, how do I draw a label? I need some place to draw the label on, which is the label. The image on, which is the label. And I need to somehow associate this image and the label, and I do that with this set pixmap method call, right? So label is an object of the QLabel class, and this is a method of the QLabel class, and this is the parameter I'm passing in. And if I run it now, hey, look at that. Back in more groomed days. All right, so that's something, and I could imagine, making a button of some kind. So, but the problem is, if I have this button, and it's gonna have a signal that says the button was pressed, how do I make that label do something? So the labels know how to do a few things, but one of them it doesn't know how to do, for example, is take some set of images and change from one to the next. So I have to invent my own way of doing it. But the slot for the pressing a button, doesn't know anything about these different images or anything like that. And so I need some way to get the information connected from one thing to the other. So I need a little more shared information somehow. And so the problem is that this function that I might make a slot doesn't really know. Again, I can't send it as a parameter because the way that the slot is defined is already set. I can't add additional parameters to it. So instead, the standard way in PyQt to sort of solve this problem is to use an object-oriented style, and you make your own custom widget that inherits from an existing widget, and then you add in instance variables. And so, of course, all the code in that class can access those instance variables, and so you can actually make a slot that knows about those instance variables and does something about it. So let's give that a try. So I'm going to make a class, and I'm going to call it image switch, because I'm going to switch between two images. And it's going to inherit from QWidget. I could maybe image switch. If I was doing something more specialized, like I want to make a custom kind of button, I would inherit from QButton or something like that. But in this case, I'm doing sort of a general widget. Now, in any class, we typically have to define an init, and I'm going to have, it takes in self, and then I'm going to have it take in a single image to start. Maybe we'll add one later when I start switching or something like that. When you inherit from a class, your first job is to call the init of the superclass. In this case, we need to call it to set up the QWidget properties. So it kind of, it sets up the PyQt sort of aspect of it by initializing the QWidget. So this super call here calls the constructor of this QWidget class that we inherit from. Then I want to store my image somewhere. So I'm going to make an instance variable. And again, any object that gets built then will have this image stored in it, and we can access it through the instance variable here. Now, Python PyQt, also my cat, noise, seems like a certain style. It wants you to define a setup UI method of the class. And so I'm going to define this setup UI. And again, this isn't required. It's just something that if you go look around online, the PyQt community thinks this is a good way to organize your code. And it's not a bad way for sure. So in the constructor, you set up some instance variables, and then you call a method that kind of finishes setting up this widget. And you define in here the sort of the PyQt part of it, the UI part of it. So in here, and I want you to remember at this point, self is an object that is already a QWidget kind of object. So this thing is already sort of a QWidget sort of object. I want to apply a layout to the image switch widget class. And so I'm going to define a layout, and it's going to be a Q vertical box layout. So that should be something that arranges things vertically. And I'm going to apply to this widget I'm building, this image switch widget, I'm going to set the layout to be that layout. Now notice I didn't make this self here. I could have, but in some ways the only place I care about the layout is when I'm setting up the UI. I set it and forget it. So I just need to kind of create a variable long enough to send it to the widget and set the layout internally. And after that, I don't need this name around here anymore. So this is a local variable, as opposed to like up here, I'm going to use image1 in various places in the class, and so I made it an instance variable so we can use it in other methods. And I'm going to add to this widget or this layout a button. So we need a button to press to switch from one image to the next. So I'm going to make a Q push button. And again, I always kind of have to go look at an example to remind, is it Q button, Q push button, what exactly is it? But it's good to just sort of follow along to some kind of example. And to the layout, I'm going to add a widget, that top button. Then I need someplace to draw the image. And so I need a label. So I'm going to have, the other thing is, this button also, I don't need to access it directly, so I could have create it, and then I just sort of forget about it, basically. Okay, so I'm going to make a new label, but this label I'm going to use in other places. So this is stuff that, maybe you do it as a local variable, and then later you decide you need to access to it, and so you go back and make it an instance variable by putting self dot in front of it or something like that. And that's okay. It's all, when you program, it's all a iterative process of building things up and then realizing kind of where you're going down a dead end and being willing to change it a little bit. So I make a Q label, and again, that's now replacing this kind of thing down here. And then I want to, on that label, set the pix map to what? Well, I want it to be this thing here, the image that's stored in that instance variable. Notice I couldn't just say image1 here because there is no image1 local variable in this method right here. It only exists up here, but self.image1 has already been set, and so I can use self.image1 down here. And then to the layout, I'm going to add this self.label. And again, it's sort of really easy here to kind of forget about what's an instance variable and what's just like a local variable, and you have to kind of concentrate and make sure you're doing the right thing. Okay, in some ways, we're at a point now where we've built some things, and we should see if it's going to work. So here I'm making a Q application, and now instead of a label, I'm going to make a new image switch widget. And I have to give it the image when I build it. Sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around there. Right, so the constructor for image switch takes in an image and stores it, and so I need to pass in that image to I'm going to call it switcher maybe, and switcher. All right. So in some ways we've sort of hidden some stuff now. The label is down inside this image switch thing. But we basically get an image, we send it to build this thing, and then show it, and hopefully something will happen. Okay, so we actually are starting to build up our application a little bit here. We have our button, and then this is the label where its pix map was set to be my image. And these are arranged in a vertical layout as defined by the layout. And again, there are different kind of layouts one can use. So nothing happens yet. So if I run this thing and switch the image, it doesn't do anything. It still acts like a button because that's what PyQt provides for us, that kind of flashing and the look and feel of it and stuff like that. But we don't actually have any way to connect that button press to something to do with the image. For something to happen, I guess I need another image. Maybe I should have just gone for it the first time. So we need two images. I'm going to store it in image 2, which is not very exciting. If I had more than 2 images, I should store them in a list probably, right? And just keep adding them as needed. Maybe I'd have an add image method, and then I could just add as many as I wanted. It doesn't have to be 2. So this is a little primitive setup. I basically know there's 2 things here. Okay, so somehow I need to make a connection. That's a hint, right? I need to make a connection between, oops, now it doesn't run because I was going to show the thing again. pix map to, let's see, what is this called? Me too, I think. So I have two images I've already prepared, and now I send both of them to the image switch constructor because it has space for the two images, and I store both of them. And when I run it, okay, so I have the image here, I have switch image, and I need to somehow make a connection between those two things. And so it's that connect call that is so critical here, right? I'm going to say when this thing is clicked, I want a signal to be connected to something that's going to change this image here. So we actually need a method of some kind to change the image. Switch image, get self. It doesn't need any information. It's just be using the information stored in the object itself. And now the question is, in some ways, how are we going to switch it? We need to know which image we're on. And we probably could query the label and say, hey, what pix map do you have? And see if it's the same as the first image or something like that. But I'm going to just keep track of which image we're on. And I'm going to make a new instance variable using image1, and I'm going to make that true when we first start off, because we're showing image1 when we start. And then I can use that, and so this is holding a Boolean value. And I'm going to say, well, if we're using image1, let's switch it to image2, right? So if self dot using image1, and again, I could say if it's equal to true, but I could just say if if this evaluates to true, then it does the true part. So I don't have to say equal true. I just say if this thing is true. So if self image using image1, what do we want to do in that case? Well, if we're on 1, we want to go to 2. So we can do that by getting to that label and setting the pix map. So again, notice this is why making the label an instance variable was key here, because now I can use it down here. If it was just a local variable image, I have no access to it anymore. And so that's good. Set it to image2. And that's not quite enough. I need to now say that using image1 is false, because now we're using image2. So it's not true that we're using image1. All right? If using image1 is false, that means we're showing image2, and I now want to set it to back to image1. Notice the else here is good. If I did 2 ifs in a row, it would be, are we using image1, change it to image2, and then are we using image2, which would be true, change it back to image1, and it would just, like, before we even see it, it would flip back and forth. So let's get this fixed up and then talk about it one more time. If I was using more images, I would probably have an index into a list and increment the index and then cycle back to 0 when I get too far. That way you could have, again, like 10 images that you cycle around. So here's a switch image thing. And it says if we're using image1, then change it to image2 and say that we're no longer using image1. Otherwise, if we are not using image1, we must be using image2. So set the pix map back to image1. And say we are using image1 now, right? It's not quite right yet, but I'm gonna leave that the way it is for the moment. And now we have a thing to connect to. So in our setup UI, I'm gonna make a connection between the clicked signal of the top button. So connect it, and I'm going to connect it to this method that does stuff for us, right? So here I'm defining some layouts and some widgets. And then the final step, I like to do sort of at the end, is make all the connections between them. And you can have, if you have multiple widgets, you might have multiple connections, but in this case, we're connecting this thing, the button, and it gets a clicked signal. And this says, don't run it now, but when you're running the program and that button gets clicked, make this thing run. And this thing running switches the image. All right, so let's try running this again. Can't tell any difference. Switch image. Hey. So all of a sudden I'm able to switch between those two images. That's pretty nice. Now, what if I don't want to click? Like, you don't make a animated movie by having a bunch of images and just like pressing this real fast kind of thing, right? It somehow animates itself. And so that's not something generated by a user, that's something generated by the computer. And there's a mechanism in PyQt for your code to generate signals or generate events, basically. And one mechanism for that is called a timer. So the timer basically pauses some set amount of time and then creates some sort of signal that goes. So to do that, you have to import this QTimer. And then where do I want to use the timer in the setup UI? Yeah, let's set it up in the setup UI. So I'm going to add a timer, and I'm going to make a new QTimer and store it in there. And then I'm going to say for this timer, I want to take its signal, and it's called a timeout signal. So it waits for a certain amount of time, and then it generates this timeout signal. And whenever time that happens, I want to connect that signal to switch image. Right? And it's not enough just to set up that connection. I have to then tell the timer to actually start. And I give some kind of somehow I don't know, stopped my recording briefly, so I restart stuff. I'll piece this back together when we're done. So basically there's this timer, and we're saying wait for 500 milliseconds, which is half a second, and keep doing that over and over again. And each time it timeouts, it's going to call this switch image. So I can run this. So 1,000, 2, it's going like twice a second, basically, right? So that's kind of fun. And of course, it's also fun. Just make it go a lot faster. Very fast. At a certain point, you're going faster than the screen refreshes, so you're not really seeing it. Whoa, and I did some... I don't know what happened there. This still actually does something, but it's fighting with a timer, so I can't really tell that it's switching. Maybe if I go slower again, something bad is happening. I think when I shouldn't be canceling it up here. I should just be closing the application. But if I go for 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds, and I can still click that, right? So both are happening. And in fact, the ordering gets a little tricky to know what is going on. All right, so that's kind of it. This is this is the way we should be building up our applications. We're going to have a class that inherits from something kind of basic, and then we inside there sort of create any instance variables we need to use throughout the code to make our interface work. We do a setup UI, which again is more of just a convention rather than a key part of either Python or PyQt. And in here we create little widgets that we want to attach to the main body, the Q widget. And then we connect things together. And sometimes those connections are connecting some sort of things that are responding to users, and sometimes there's this timer idea that makes it really easy to just update a game or an application every 1/10 of a second or something like that, and you get the delay in milliseconds. And then here we've defined a custom slot, and this slot is not a function, it's a method, and that gives us a lot of power because in that method we can again get access to a bunch of different kinds of pieces of information that's stored in the class. Or stored in the object of the class. And so that makes it a lot easier to sort of connect these things together. Down here, this really should be in a main function. I just make an application. I make an example of our custom sort of application and show it, and then run the PyQt game loop, and we're good to go. So, there's sort of a lot to grasp here, and to be honest with you, when I do it, I need to kind of look at examples and follow along. But our goal here is to kind of build you up to a level of complexity where we can do some kind of project, and we'll be at that pretty soon. Even though it seems like you're just kind of getting the hang of this a little bit. So anyway, appreciate you listening, and you should look at the code and try to run it, and try to make something run faster or slower or something like that. All right, let me stop my recording. Bye.